To hell with the police. What did they expect from me? A full detailed description. My attacker was a woman, likely in her mid-30s. She wore a hat and dark glasses. How was I supposed to estimate her age with that disguise? That vague description was the best I could manage. I'm probably rambling. Let me start from the beginning. Maybe that will help it make more sense. I truly hope writing it all out will help me make sense of it myself. The shock of being assaulted without reason in broad daylight was so far removed from anything I'd ever experienced that I struggled to wrap my head around it. Just a few hours earlier, I'd been on top of the world. My life was perfect. A lovely home, a healthy bank account, and a husband who treated me like a queen. But none of that was the reason I was practically glowing as I stepped out of the office at the end of my workday. The real cause of my joy was something less public. My husband was away on a business trip for the week, and I had plans for a date with my lover, John, as soon as I could get home and prepare. John was a recent addition to my life and had shown me experiences in bed that no man ever had before. That was why I had a bounce in my step and a grin on my face as I walked toward my car in the office parking lot. I had just reached my car when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Turning around, hoping against hope it was John, I instead saw a fist hurtling toward my face. I barely caught sight of an angry female face behind the punch before pain exploded in my mouth. Instinct took over, and I dropped to the ground, curling into a ball to shield myself as the woman, silent the entire time, began kicking me in the back. She must have gotten tired at some point because the next thing I knew, she was gone. Terrified she might come back, I called emergency services. An ambulance arrived and took me to the hospital where I was lucky enough to be seen right away beating the usual evening rush. Aside from a split lip and some bruises, I was declared fine. The doctor gave me vague advice to monitor myself for symptoms of delayed concussion, apply ice to the bruises, and sent me home. The police interviewed me in the waiting room after my exam, but all I could offer them was a scant description. A slim, blonde woman wearing a hat and dark glasses. There was little chance of catching her. I couldn't even tell them if her hair color was real, much less offer any insight into her motive. When I asked for a ride back to my car, they explained it wasn't allowed. I attempted a helpless smile to coax them, but it hurt my lip too much. Next, I tried calling John, intending to ask him for a ride and cancel our plans for the evening. He didn't answer. Left with no other choice, I called a cab. My revised plan for the night was to grab a bottle of vodka, which I considered a painkiller, add ice for the bruises, and enjoy a long hot bath before calling my husband after his workday. He always had a way of putting things into perspective and making me laugh when I was down. After telling him what happened, I wouldn't have been surprised if he dropped everything to make the 4-hour drive home. He always made me his priority. I had only been home for about half an hour. The bath was ready, and I'd just cooled my martini with ice when there was a knock at the door. Assuming it was the delivery driver with my Chinese takeout, I opened the door. When I woke up, I had only hazy fragments of what had occurred. My head throbbed as I tried to sit up, and I gingerly eased myself back down, feeling my face with cautious fingers. Something crusty had dried on it. I scraped a bit off and examined it under my fingernail. Blood. Dread crept over me. Carefully, I ran my hands over my face. My eyebrows, cheekbones, and jaw seemed unscathed. My nose was tender but intact. Thankfully, not broken. Slowly turning my head, I noticed dried blood splattered on the floor. Whoever attacked me must have hit me hard. Continuing my self-assessment, I found a bump on the back of my head, tender and bruised, likely from hitting the floor. Despite the pain, I forced myself upright, slammed the door shut, and stumbled to the couch, collapsing onto it. I think I drifted in and out of hallucinations, my mind conjuring fragmented images somewhere between memories and vivid dreams. A short, stocky woman with long black hair and thick eyebrows flashed through my mind, her face partially obscured by a scarf. All I could make out was a wooden object, a bat, maybe, swinging straight at me. When I fully came to, still sprawled on the couch, the clock above the mantel read 4:25 a.m. My head felt like it was filled with a heavy, rattling ball, crashing painfully against my skull as I staggered to the kitchen. I became aware of a new pain in my groin. Whoever the woman was, she must have kicked me there. The soreness radiated across my left labia and the inner thigh. I swallowed 2 painkillers before dragging myself to the bathroom. The mirror revealed an unsettling sight: a black eye, a bruised cheek, and a face that had narrowly escaped worse injuries. Whoever these women were, this one and the one from earlier, I had no clue. I couldn't think of anyone I'd wronged badly enough to provoke this kind of violence. As a real estate agent, I hadn't made any enemies that I knew of. None of this made any sense. I debated calling an ambulance, but decided against it. The doctor from earlier had warned about monitoring for delayed concussion symptoms within 8 hours, and that window had already passed. I also thought about calling the police again, but ultimately didn't. With my house set back from the road and no new details to offer, it seemed pointless. One random attack could be dismissed as bizarre, but 2 in the same day? That was beyond comprehension. Even though it was late, I decided to call Dave. He'd know what to do. Oh, what would Dave have thought last night when he tried to reach me as he usually did and I didn't pick up? He would have called my mobile and the house phone, wondering where I might be. I hoped it didn't lead him to suspect I'd been sneaking out while he was away. I had always been incredibly cautious with my affairs. It would be ironic if he got the wrong idea from something that wasn't even real. Grabbing my phone, I checked for any missed calls from him. Oddly, there were none. Then I picked up the house phone and checked its call history. The last missed call was from 3 days ago. What on earth? I couldn't remember a time when Dave hadn't spoken to me while he was away. It was actually part of our safety arrangement. I usually called him on his hotel phone, claiming it was safer than using a mobile too often. That excuse had conveniently allowed me to meet my lover John at motels, or, on rare occasions, invite him over. Speaking of which, I remembered that I'd called John from my phone yesterday afternoon, but hadn't yet deleted the call log. I wasn't careless enough to save his number in my contacts. And with no evidence left behind, there was nothing to trace. Some photos on the phone were incriminating, though they were hidden. My phone was the only place they existed. For added security, I didn't use a typical password or a pattern, only a fingerprint and a complex code. Dave believed it was work-related policy to keep my phone secure. If he ever needed to use it, I'd unlock it myself and never let it out of my sight. I figured storing everything on my phone, which I could control, was safer than using other media that could be discovered. I quickly deleted the call to John, left him a voicemail, and realized he hadn't returned my earlier call either. It felt strange that Dave hadn't called me at all. Despite the early hour, I decided to phone him. I really needed to hear his voice. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was unusual. Perhaps he had misplaced his charger and his phone battery had died. It wouldn't be the first time. By now, it was after 5 in the morning, and I had a showing scheduled at 9. There was no way I could show up looking the way I did. I laid out more makeup than usual to cover the damage. Thankfully, I had a decent collection. Let me explain. In high school, I was the plain girl, the one who watched from the sidelines as all the boys she liked chased after the sporty, popular girls who had developed early. I took pride in not being like some of the other plain girls who tried to gain attention by giving themselves away, in the false belief that it made them desirable. When I graduated at 16, I was still a virgin. My parents weren't particularly ambitious for me, so they happily supported me while I took night classes to earn various administrative qualifications and worked as a waitress during the day. I lost my virginity to a man who, I later realized, had been manipulative. After a brief, uncomfortable encounter in his hotel room, he asked me to leave the next morning. I chalked it up to experience and thought I'd learned how to pick better partners. I hadn't. My next 2 relationships ended just as badly. The one after that was with someone even less experienced than I was, and I ended it after one night. That was my life until I turned 20. That's when Dave reappeared. He'd been a year ahead of me in school and was, in many ways, the male version of me. Tall and lean, but otherwise unremarkable. We ran into each other at the restaurant where I worked, where he'd brought some clients for lunch. After our first chat, I could tell he was a man with a clear career path and the determination to follow it. When he asked me out, I said yes. And the rest, as they say, is history. 2 weeks into our relationship, we slept together. Neither of us had much experience, so it was awkward, but we were both eager to learn and used each other as practice. If I had to sum up the year leading up to my 21st birthday, I'd say it was content. I had a boyfriend who was clearly going places and adored me. We weren't part of the high-end social scene, but we didn't care. We moved into an apartment together, and I started a real estate course, funded by Dave. Then came my 21st birthday, a turning point in my life. Dave was celebrating his first major bonus, and he used part of it to spoil me. He got me my own car, a voucher for 2 days with a personal beauty consultant, and a bigger diamond engagement ring than I'd ever dreamed of wearing. I said yes at the right time, drove the car, but held off on using the voucher. How I wish I'd torn it up instead. Maybe then I wouldn't have a bruised face or a husband whose phone was switched off. Dave brought up the voucher a few times, but I was too busy planning a simple wedding. Neither of us had a large circle of friends, so it wasn't a grand affair in the end. I decided to use the voucher as a small treat for myself, a way to unwind before the big day. That's when I discovered what it was actually for. It turned into 2 full days with Caroline, a woman in her 30s with an air of sophistication. I couldn't tell you her exact credentials, but she had an incredible talent for showcasing femininity. The first stop was a hair salon where I was coaxed into a dramatic makeover. I was anxious about the outcome, but the rest of that day was spent shopping. Caroline bypassed my usual favorite stores and led me to the high-end boutiques in town. By mid-afternoon, she was already using my phone to persuade Dave to authorize some life support for my credit card. By the end of the day, I looked at myself in the mirror with my new hairstyle and outfit and almost called Caroline to tell her not to bother coming back. The look seemed meant for someone beautiful, and that wasn't me. But I didn't make that call. The following morning, we were at the spa by 8 o'clock. I was indulged with a pedicure, manicure, facial, and scalp massage before being introduced to Colin. He was flamboyant, full of energy, and had a larger-than-life personality. According to him, he'd once worked as a makeup artist for big-name celebrities. For the next 2 hours, he and Caroline worked on my face like artists on a canvas, painting, sculpting, trimming, and highlighting, redoing parts several times. I wasn't allowed to see my reflection until they both declared me perfect. When I finally stood up and saw myself in the mirror, I instinctively stepped back. That was when I understood Caroline's true skill. The hair and clothes that had felt so out of place the day before now framed a face I could hardly believe was mine. I was stunned by how beautiful I looked. Caroline had to drag me away from the mirror for a 2-hour crash course with Colin, who explained how he'd uncovered what he called the natural masterpiece of me. I thanked them both profusely for what felt like a life-changing experience. If I'd known how much it would alter things, I might have committed a crime to stop it. When I got home, Dave did a double take, but quickly recovered, telling me the process had simply revealed the person he'd always seen. That night was the most passionate one we'd ever had, and 3 days later, we were married. The wedding reception and honeymoon were overwhelming for me. Handsome men who had never paid me any attention before now seemed eager to dance with me. I accepted whenever Dave didn't object. He wasn't a fan of dancing, after all. Even with all that attention, I didn't fully grasp how much things had shifted. That understanding began when we received our wedding photo album. Seeing the pictures, I realized just how stunning I had become. For the first time, I felt like I'd married someone a little beneath my level. It wasn't fair or logical, especially when you compared what Dave had achieved in the 5 years since our marriage. He had built a successful business from scratch and was well on his way to becoming a millionaire. Meanwhile, I had used my looks to become a mediocre real estate agent. Despite this imbalance, I couldn't help feeling superior. The months following my transformation felt like a new beginning. I was popular, admired, and confident. But with that came temptation, and within months I had become an unfaithful wife. It was difficult to resist when my mind still thought it was attached to an average body. Yet I was being pursued by men who looked like models. It took waking up with a third of these men to realize they were just better-looking versions of the man who had taken my virginity. From that moment, I took full control over choosing my lovers. Now, back in the present, I layered on concealer and foundation to hide my bruises, feeling miserable. I kept trying to call Dave every 15 minutes, but there was no answer. Took me over an hour to cover everything to my satisfaction. Still unable to reach my husband or make sense of the bizarre attacks by the two women, I made myself a coffee, feeling lonelier than ever. I'd never been good at forming close friendships with other women, and without Dave responding, I was isolated at one of my darkest moments. With some time to kill, I sent a text to John asking him to call me when he could. Then I watched mindless TV until it was time to head to the office. Carrying my laptop bag and the flashy briefcase Dave had bought me last year, I went to my car in the detached garage. After placing them on the back seat and shutting the door, I turned toward the driver's side. Suddenly, she was there. I had no idea where she had come from, but when I turned, she was standing right in front of me. She must have been hiding along the side of the garage or somewhere else nearby. It all happened so fast that much of it was a blur. I remember falling to the ground and instinctively raising my arms to shield my face as she stomped on my hands and arms. When the attack finally stopped, I made a run for the house. The intensity of her blows had been shocking, and my face stung. I leaned against the locked door briefly before staggering to the downstairs bathroom. In the mirror, I saw 3 long scratches down my left cheek and 2 on the right, clearly made by fingernails. My right arm and hand were sore, but thankfully nothing was broken. I called the police again and then tried both Dave and John while waiting for them to arrive. Neither answered, leaving me feeling completely alone. Just after 9, the office called to ask why I'd missed my appointment with a client. They were only slightly appeased when I explained I'd been attacked. Working in real estate, they seemed to assume the worst. I wondered if the police thought I was lying or exaggerating the extent of my injuries. It was clear they weren't much help. In fact, it felt like they thought I was wasting their time. What with a murder and 2 armed robberies reported the day before, especially with my vague description of a woman of average height with red or auburn hair that could easily be natural or dyed. Most of it had been hidden beneath a baseball cap anyway. They spoke briefly to a couple of neighbors for appearance's sake, then left after asking if I needed an ambulance. No, I didn't need an ambulance. I needed my husband to pick up his phone so I could hear his comforting voice amidst my confusion. Frustrated, I slammed the door behind them and walked into the living room. Staring at a photo of Dave and me on the mantel, I yelled, "Next time, you will take your charger, David, even if I have to pack it for you." Being attacked by 1 random woman was odd enough. 2 was statistically unlikely. But 3? That bordered on impossible. It was time to seriously consider why I might have made so many enemies. Nothing came to mind. To make matters worse, I couldn't cover up the scratches this time. I had to use makeup remover to clean off the earlier layers of cream before applying disinfectant to the new wounds. Who knew what bacteria were lurking under that woman's nails? The makeup remover pad stung unbearably, and the disinfectant felt like gasoline on raw skin. My right hand was becoming stiff from the bruising, making the task even more challenging. By the time I was finished, my face was red and blotchy. To top it all off, the latest attacker must have been wearing heels. Distinct bruises were beginning to form on my hands and forearms. I tried Dave's phone again, desperate to hear his voice, but once more it went straight to voicemail. Then it hit me. I could send him an email. Surely, when he read it, he'd rush home immediately. The problem was that my laptop was still in the car. Moving like a 90-year-old woman, I shuffled down the stairs, my lower back, legs, and groin aching and stiffening with every step. But as I reached to unlock the front door, I froze. The thought of what might be waiting outside paralyzed me. I scolded myself for my fear and tried to rally. Those countless realtor seminars finally came in handy. I gave myself a pep talk. Surely, after 3 attacks, whatever grudge these women held had been satisfied. Perhaps it was all a case of mistaken identity. Determined to think logically, I analyzed my surroundings. From the front of the house, I could see the garage door, but not beyond the wall on the far side of it. If someone were lying in wait, they'd have plenty of hiding spots. On the other hand, if I exited through the back door, I could sneak around the house and approach the garage from a less predictable angle. I moved from room to room, checking the view from the windows to map out a safe route. The problem was the backyard. It was secluded. If someone ambushed me there, no one would see or hear it happen. I wasn't in any condition to defend myself, let alone fight off another attack. As I debated my options, my phone rang. "Dave, I thought, rushing to grab it despite my bruised and aching lambs. But it wasn't him. It was the office, calling to inform me they'd rescheduled the client I'd missed to meet me at the property in 30 minutes. My attempts to explain my injuries were dismissed. The agency was running a tight ship in tough times, and they made it clear they could find someone else to replace me if I couldn't handle the job. Jerks! That still left the problem of getting to my car safely. Then a light bulb went off. I could call a cab. I provided explicit instructions for the driver to park directly in the driveway where I could see them from the house. There was still the possibility of someone hiding behind the garage or the hedge along the property line, but surely I'd be safe with the taxi driver as a witness. While waiting for the cab, I did my best to fix my face, though there wasn't much that could be done. When the horn honked 10 minutes later, I checked outside one last time, then made an awkward sprint to the safety of the vehicle. I didn't relax until we were a block away from the house. Even then, I couldn't shake my unease. The driver, a woman, put me on edge, but after asking for my destination, she quickly lost interest in me. 15 minutes later, as we neared the property where I was meeting the client, a horrifying realization struck. I'd forgotten the keys. They were in my briefcase, still on the back seat of my car in the garage. If I told the cab to turn around, I'd be at least 25 minutes late, and the client, already annoyed, might demand I be fired. I decided to press on. I'd show the client the exterior of the property and blame a mix-up with the keys. It was likely I'd lose the sale, but at least I might avoid being dismissed. As the cab pulled into the driveway of the house, I tried Dave's number one more time. Still no answer. I ended up waiting half an hour for the client to arrive, and she also came by taxi. She was a tall woman in her 30s, with dark hair and striking looks. Unless her sunglasses concealed something unflattering about her eyes, she carried one of those oversized handbags that seemed to be the latest trend. As she approached, she glanced down at a piece of paper in her hand before shoving it into her bag. She seemed to accept my explanation about the missing keys, though her annoyance was evident as I explained that all I could offer was a walkthrough of the exterior and a peek through the windows. Thankfully, I knew the property details by heart, so I didn't need to refer to any notes. Those, like the keys, were still in my briefcase in the car. In the back of my mind, I thought that if the house didn't sell quickly, the owners might lower the price, making it a potential buy for Dave and me. It was a charming, leafy neighborhood, perfect for young professionals like us. We moved to the backyard, and I highlighted the spacious artist studio detached from the main house. After describing its features, I walked over to the master bedroom window, peeking through a gap in the curtains to show her the view. Behind me, I heard an odd sound that didn't belong. Looking back, I'd describe it as a faint clicking noise. When I turned around, I saw the client holding an extendable baton, the kind advertised in women's magazines for self-defense. Her once attractive face was twisted with hatred. I think she hissed something under her breath before swinging the baton at me with all her strength, aiming for my head. I barely managed to block it with my arms, but the pain was excruciating. I actually heard the sickening crack of a bone breaking, and I think she did too. Her rage seemed to dissipate as she stood there, watching me scream in agony. As I lowered my injured arm and the pain fully hit, she lashed out again, striking the side of my head. I managed to deflect most of the blow with my uninjured arm, but it still knocked me to the ground. By the time I came to my senses, she was gone. But something had fallen out of her bag when she pulled out the baton. It lay face up on the ground. It was a photograph, a 5-sized if I had to guess, and I recognized it instantly. It was one of my favorites, a picture I'd taken myself. I was completely baffled as to how this furious woman had gotten her hands on it. The image was a selfie I'd snapped about 3 months ago with my phone held out at arm's length. Despite everything, I couldn't help but admire my presence of mind to capture the shot. The good framing was sheer luck. In the photo, I was on my elbows and knees, my back arched, gazing into the camera with a look of ecstasy. Behind me, John was kneeling, his face contorted in a primal expression. It was a perfect snapshot of a passionate moment, taken in a grimy motel room we'd paid for in cash. A day I remembered as one of the most thrilling of my life. It was clear that this picture had been used to identify me. Judging by the client's fury, she had to be Mrs. John. I'd never asked John about his wife, just as he'd never asked about Dave. It had never seemed important enough to discuss. Cradling my broken arm, I managed to push myself into a sitting position. There was no internal debate this time. I immediately called an ambulance. But I avoided contacting the police. I couldn't risk my affair coming to light and Dave finding out. The thought of how John's enraged wife had gotten her hands on that photo consumed me as I staggered toward the front of the property to wait for the ambulance. I had never shared that picture with anyone, nor stored it anywhere other than on my phone. Not even John had access to it. Had my phone been hacked? That was the only explanation that came to mind. At the hospital, I encountered the same triage nurse as before. She wanted to call the police, but I convinced her it was an accident. She clearly didn't believe me, especially after examining my arm and the scratches on my face, but she respected my wishes after I shook my head vigorously at her question about involving my husband. My arm was set, but they didn't keep me overnight. They discharged me with some strong painkillers and sent me home in a taxi. The cab driver was kind enough to help me to my front door and even waited until I had unlocked it, stepped inside, and bolted it shut. Despite the doctor's advice, I washed down the painkillers with a very large vodka, while frantically trying to come up with a believable story for Dave. He would be utterly confused and worried when he finally charged his phone and listened to the voicemails I'd left after 3 of the attacks. I tried calling him again, but there was still no answer. Then I remembered my earlier plan to send him an email. Unfortunately, my laptop was still in the car. And now that it was dark outside, there was no chance I was going to risk venturing out to get it. Then I remembered the old desktop computer we used before switching to laptops. Dave still occasionally used it when he wanted to view something on a larger screen, though it mostly sat idle in the study. I turned it on and went to refill my vodka. When I returned, the screen displayed a spinning hourglass and the word synchronizing. Synchronizing with what? I wasn't sure. Nature called, and the process of undoing the side zipper on my pants with one arm in a sling took far longer than it should have. By the time I got back, the computer had finished its task, and the horrifying result was on full display. That explained everything. Who those vicious women were, and why they had done what they did to me. Oddly, that clarity was almost comforting after the chaos of the past 24 hours. What was on the screen revealed far more than just the identities of my attackers. It also explained why, for the first time in ages, Dave hadn't called me while away on his business trip, why he wasn't answering his phone, and why he might never call again. The truth was devastating. My arrogance had likely destroyed my life. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting in agony. Touching the tender left side of my face, I ran my fingers over the bruises and scratches on the right. Then, I left the bathroom to turn off the monitor, unable to bear the sickening and damning images. Somehow, the old desktop, rarely used, was displaying the photos from my phone. Specifically, the pictures I had taken care to keep hidden. Now, they were flashing across the computer screen, one every 10 seconds. Images of houses and interior features, harmless enough, alternated with far more explicit ones. Suddenly, I remembered an event from a few weeks earlier. My boss had hired a tech company to upgrade our phones, and I had watched closely as a technician worked on mine. It was now painfully clear that one of the changes he made had caused all my photos, even the carefully hidden ones, to sync with the desktop computer. If they had synced there, could they have synced elsewhere? Dread consumed me as I thought of Dave's laptop, a far more modern device than the old PC. I could easily imagine him scrolling through the collection of over 100 explicit trophy photos. Images meant solely for my eyes, featuring me and a series of different men in compromising positions. Worse, I could envision him cropping out the faces of my lovers, printing the photos and taking them to my workplace. Our receptionist, who always had a soft spot for him, might eagerly match the faces to client records. From there, it wouldn't be hard to trace names to addresses, and to their wives. Wives who, as in my case, might retaliate with violence. My broken bones and bruises were a painful testament to that possibility. After another failed attempt to reach Dave, I trudged upstairs to check his closet. What I found only deepened my despair. Bracing myself, I returned to the study, grimacing as I faced the incriminating photos again. I switched the monitor back on and logged into our online banking account. The sight of shockingly low numbers where there should have been large ones confirmed my fears. Dropping my head into my hands, I was struck by the realization of how far I had fallen. I had become selfish, entitled, and deceitful, convinced I deserved the attention of men who, at least visually, seemed to be in my league. I'd pursued them recklessly, selecting from a pool of male clients without regard for the consequences. Early on, I had strict rules. No photos, no videos, no evidence of any kind. But over time, I grew complacent. I made mistakes along the way, like the time a lover wanted more from our relationship than I did. That incident nearly exposed me, and it prompted me to establish a new boundary. I would only involve myself with married men who had as much to lose as I did. Unfortunately, I let my guard down when I realized Dave trusted me completely. That was a colossal error. I should have stuck to my no photos rule, but arrogance blinded me. I berated myself, wondering how I could have been so foolish. I had become the popular girl I once envied in school, validating my newfound status by sleeping with jocks. My arrogance lay in believing my marriage would withstand such betrayal. I wasn't naive enough to think Dave couldn't discover my indiscretions, but I had crafted a plan for that eventuality. I was certain he would accept it. After all, where could he find someone of my caliber again? The plan depended on him discovering only one affair. I would claim it was a moment of weakness and describe my lover as a master manipulator. I'd cry, promise it would never happen again, and wait for his forgiveness.